The Oregon Trail. A time when people didn't just throw their lives away on the stock market or influencer careers, they did it with dysentery and terribly maintained wagons. Picture it, you, a young, bright-eyed 20-something with dreams of manifest destiny, only to be manifestly miserable 5 miles in. You thought a road trip to Coachella was tough? Try a 6-month slog where the only rest stop is a hastily dug latrine, and the only vibe check is a broken axle that strands you in the middle of nowhere. But somebody had to make this ridiculous, doomed migration work. So let's talk about the brave souls who took up jobs on the Oregon Trail, what they did, and how most of them were either completely essential or deeply, deeply unfortunate. First, let's meet the wagon master, the CEO of your death march. This guy was the one who made the calls, decided when to move, where to stop, and if you got to sleep near the fire or next to Jerry, who hasn't bathed since Kansas. He was either a grizzled mountain man who'd seen things, or a guy who lied about his qualifications and was going to get you all killed, both equally possible. His main job? Keeping everyone in line and making sure the whole wagon train didn't devolve into anarchy, because nothing inspires lawlessness quite like day 72 of eating salted pork and hoping you don't get mauled by a bear. Then we have the scout. This was the human Google Maps, except instead of turn-by-turn directions, he'd ride ahead to see if there were water sources, mountain passes, or bandits who wanted to turn the entire group into an all-you-can-stab buffet. If he was good at his job, you'd find the best path forward. If he was bad, well, congratulations, you just discovered the scenic route to starvation. Now, let's talk about the blacksmith, the unsung hero. This guy was the reason your wagon wheels stayed attached, your tools didn't fall apart, and your horse didn't have to run around barefoot like some kind of equine hobbit. Blacksmiths were basically the ID department of the Oregon Trail. Nobody noticed them until everything went catastrophically wrong. Then suddenly, everyone was praying this guy could turn a pile of scrap into something useful before the next river crossing. Speaking of making sure people didn't die immediately, we had the doctor, or more accurately, the guy with a bone saw and a really optimistic attitude about survival rates. Medicine at the time was mostly a fun game of what will kill you slower. Got an infection? Time to apply whiskey and prayers. Broken leg? Congratulations, you now own one fewer leg. Childbirth? Good luck. Every doctor was just playing Oregon Trail on nightmare difficulty, and their success rate was a real mixed bag. Then there was the hunter. Think of him as the original DoorDash, except if he messed up, you didn't just have to wait a little longer. You got to experience firsthand what starvation feels like. His job was to shoot enough buffalo or deer to keep everyone fed, but not so many that he personally caused an ecological disaster. And yes, that did happen. They called it overhunting. We call it why you've never seen a wild buffalo roaming around your neighborhood. The trapper was like the hunter's weird cousin. Less about shooting things, more about catching animals in elaborate snares and then selling their skins for supplies. If you met a trapper, odds are he hadn't spoken to another human being in months, smelled strongly of raccoon, and had more life advice than any of us were prepared for. Let's talk numbers, shall we? Mortality rates on this scenic death march ranged from 4% to 10%. Doesn't sound too bad, right? Until you realize that out of 400,000 eager souls who set out, an estimated 20,000 were permanently absorbed into the prairie, their bones now part of some long-forgotten fertilizer cycle. What killed them? Oh, take your pick. Cholera was the undisputed champion of gruesome deaths, claiming nearly 6,000 lives in a torrent of unstoppable diarrhea, vomiting, and dehydration. It worked fast, turning people into husks within hours. The body would purge itself violently until the organs failed, the eyes sunk deep into the skull, and the skin turned a sickly blue from oxygen deprivation. Congratulations, you just died of explosive internal ruin because nobody believed in boiling water. Dysentery wasn't far behind, and it was basically cholera's equally sadistic cousin. It corroded your intestines like a slow-acting poison, reducing once healthy people to wailing, bedridden corpses who excreted blood until their bowels simply gave up. The smell alone was enough to make anyone consider an early departure from this plane of existence. And let's not forget typhoid fever. The bacteria entered through contaminated food or water, creeping through the bloodstream and attacking the intestines. High fever, delirium, violent abdominal pain, and a bloated stomach followed. If you were lucky, you went unconscious before your intestinal walls perforated and filled your abdomen with the kind of infection that made death seem merciful. But let's not give all the credit to disease. Drowning was a serious contender. The Oregon Trail was basically one long audition for cross that river or die trying. No bridges, no safety measures, just the raw power of nature versus humans with questionable swimming skills. The water would suck them under, fill their lungs like heavy sacks of grain, and pull them into a watery grave while the rest of the caravan watched in horror. Nearly 2,000 settlers met this fate, their bodies lost to the current, their stories swallowed whole. Gunshots were another unexpected yet common demise. It turns out that handing firearms to every malnourished, sleep-deprived traveler and assuming they knew what they were doing was a terrible idea. Roughly 1 in 10 deaths involve someone getting shot, sometimes by raiders, but mostly by their own idiot friends. A misfire, a fumbled reload, an argument that got out of hand. It all ended the same way, with someone clutching a bloody wound and realizing frontier medicine involved a rusty saw and whiskey. Then there were wagon accidents. If you think modern traffic is bad, imagine a rickety wooden cart held together with twine and prayers, bouncing over jagged rocks and occasionally flipping over, crushing entire families beneath their own supplies. The wheels, often poorly built and poorly maintained, would snap, sending wagons careening down hills like wooden missiles. Broken bones, severed limbs, and skull fractures were the norm. Wildlife didn't help either. Yes, bears were a thing, so were wolves, rattlesnakes, and the occasional territorial bison. A single wrong step in the brush could lead to a venomous bite, the flesh around the wound turning black and necrotic as the body shut down in a fevered spiral of agony. Nature was an equal opportunity killer. Dehydration turned people into brittle husks, their skin cracking like dried leather, their tongues swelling until they couldn't speak. Starvation gnawed at bones, leaving people too weak to continue before the elements finished them off. Get caught in a storm, you'd freeze stiff, frostbite creeping over your fingers and nose until there was nothing left to feel. By gender, men tended to die more often from drowning, accidents, and violence, while women and children suffered the most from disease and malnutrition. By location, the worst mortality rates were often found in modern-day Nebraska and Wyoming, because nothing says scenic route like an open expanse of death and regret. Then there were the teamsters, the people responsible for driving the wagons and making sure your oxen didn't just spontaneously die, which they often did because, again, the Oregon Trail was a series of increasingly hilarious yet tragic disasters. If you were a teamster, you basically signed up to be stressed out for 6 months straight, while people complained that their wagon was shaking too much. Imagine being an Uber driver, but your passengers are slowly dying and your vehicle is actively trying to fall apart. And of course, let's not forget the cook, the real MVP. Their job was to take whatever sad ingredients were left and turn them into something edible. If you ever wondered why so many people died of disease back then, it's because refrigeration wasn't a thing and every meal was a gamble. Cooking over an open fire sounds romantic until you realize your main seasoning option is dust. Now, if you were feeling lucky, you could always be a trader. These guys set up shop along the trail selling food, tools, and whatever junk people had thrown out of their wagons when they realized maybe bringing the entire family piano wasn't such a great idea. Traders were basically capitalism incarnate, profiting off people's bad decisions and desperation. For those with a more poetic soul, there were also entertainers and musicians. Because what's better than barely surviving the worst journey of your life? Having someone sing about it. If you were lucky, you got a fiddle player who could lift your spirits. If you were unlucky, you got some guy who thought he was the next Beethoven but only knew 3 chords. Either way, when morale dipped, these were the people keeping folks from giving up entirely. And then we had the preachers, the missionaries, and the priests. They were there to ensure your soul was ready in case you died violently, which statistically was very likely. You'd find them offering last rites, baptizing babies in rivers, and reminding everyone that God probably had a plan, even if that plan involved dying of dysentery somewhere in Nebraska. There were also lawmen, or at least self-proclaimed sheriffs, trying to keep some semblance of order. This was an era before a proper justice system, which meant law enforcement mostly boiled down to whoever could shoot the straightest and yell the loudest. If you stole someone's supplies, there was no trial. There was just a bunch of angry settlers debating whether to shoot you or banish you to fend for yourself. Neither option was great, unless we forget the undertakers, possibly the busiest people on the trail. These guys were the ones making sure you got a halfway decent burial instead of just being left for the coyotes It was a grim job, but hey, job security was excellent. At the absolute bottom of the social hierarchy, the children. Oh, you thought being a kid on the Oregon Trail meant playing with sticks and being carefree? Think again. You were free labor. You gathered firewood, herded animals, cooked, cleaned, and if you were particularly unlucky, got sent into the wilderness to find water. It was like a terrible unpaid internship, except instead of getting exposure, you just got exposure, like literally frostbite. And just when you thought the job market couldn't get any weirder, we had well diggers. These poor souls got to risk their lives trying to find water in the middle of absolute nowhere, hoping to hit a source before they collapsed from exhaustion. The success rate? Let's just say some of them became very permanent fixtures in the wells they were digging. Alright, let's tumble further down the Oregon Trail job iceberg where things go from historically necessary to wait, people actually did that? We've already covered the essentials, the wagon masters, blacksmiths, hunters, and the poor children trapped in what could only be described as a 6-month unpaid internship from hell. But now we get into the weird, the terrifying, and the professions that make you wonder if some people just woke up every morning and chose suffering. Let's start with the mule skinners. Sounds like a band that never made it past their garage phase, but no. These were the professionals responsible for wrangling the stubbornest creatures on the planet. If you ever questioned whether a mule had a soul, rest assured it did, and it hated you personally. Mule skinners had one job: get these creatures to haul wagons, plows, and cargo without deciding that today was the day they staged a coup. If you could keep your mules in line, congratulations. You were a god among men. If not, well, good luck explaining to the wagon train why their supplies were now scattered across the prairie because Hank the Mule decided he was above capitalism. And of course, there were the butchers. You ever try processing an entire buffalo with a knife that hasn't been sharpened since Missouri? It's an extreme sport. Butchers were responsible for turning whatever the hunters brought back into something edible and vaguely recognizable as food. Problem was, preservation wasn't great and meat could go rancid faster than you could say botulism. If you were lucky, you had a butcher who knew how to salt and dry meat properly. If you weren't, you spent your night contemplating your life choices over a plate of what could best be described as questionable venison. Now, if you were an absolute lunatic, you might have found yourself as a wheelwright. Imagine being the only person on the trail who knows how to fix wagon wheels. Now imagine having to do that job repeatedly because nothing screams fragile, like 19th century wooden craftsmanship. Every single rock, river, and poorly judged turn meant another cracked wheel, and every cracked wheel meant someone screaming at you to work faster before the entire wagon train was overtaken by starvation or the existential dread of endless prairie. Feeling a little religious? Great, because the Oregon Trail had its fair share of preachers, priests, and missionaries, all determined to make sure that even if your body died, your soul had somewhere better to be. Preachers held sermons, missionaries attempted to convert every living soul in sight, and priests gave last rites when things inevitably went sideways. The success rate? Mixed. Some people found comfort in the idea that there was a divine reason for their suffering. Others were too busy trying not to freeze to death in Wyoming to worry about the state of their eternal soul. Then there were the seamstresses and tailors. Ever tried walking 1,000 miles in shoes made from whatever scraps you found lying around? That's how you get blisters, infections, and a deep appreciation for anyone who knew how to make actual clothes. These folks stitched, patched, and repaired everything from coats to boots to makeshift bags. If they were really good, they could even trade their skills for better food or supplies. If they were bad, well, let's just say that a poorly stitched boot was the quickest way to find yourself barefoot in the middle of the Great Plains. The undertakers. Grim business, that one. The death toll on the trail was not exactly what you'd call low. Someone had to deal with the bodies, and it sure as hell wasn't going to be the already overworked wagon master. Undertakers dug graves, held funerals if there was time, and tried their best to keep the deceased from being immediate coyote bait. If you found yourself in this line of work, you were either very good at not being squeamish, or you had made some deeply unfortunate career decisions. Now, for those looking for a slightly more high-stakes profession, there was the gold prospector. This wasn't technically a trail job, but plenty of people on the way to Oregon decided that maybe, just maybe, they could strike it rich if they veered a little south into California. Spoiler alert, most of them did not. Prospecting was less about finding actual gold and more about finding out how quickly your dreams could be crushed by the brutal indifference of the universe. If you were lucky, you got enough gold to trade for a better life. If you weren't, you got a lifetime of dirt, disappointment, and occasional bears. And what's a good frontier adventure without a cobbler? Shoes were not optional on the Oregon Trail unless you had a serious death wish. Cobbler work was crucial because feet took a beating on this journey if you lost your boots to a freak river crossing incident, which happened way more than you'd think. You were either going to beg a cobbler to fix you up or resign yourself to learning how to walk barefoot over jagged rocks. Either way, the cobbler held the power to decide whether your feet lived or died. And then, the absolute worst job on the entire trail, the well digger. Oh, you like water? So did everyone else. Problem was, finding it required someone willing to dig into the earth like they were being personally punished by the gods. Well, diggers worked under the constant risk of cave-ins, dehydration, ironic I know, and the crushing realization that sometimes there just wasn't any water to be found. If they succeeded, everyone lived. If they failed, well, let's just say people started eyeing the weakest members of the group for alternative hydration strategies. Lastly, we have the absolute wild card, the entertainers. Someone had to keep spirits up, and if you weren't cracking jokes, playing music, or telling stories around the fire, then what were you even doing? These were the people preventing the wagon train from turning into a traveling existential crisis. If you were a good entertainer, you could lift morale and maybe even trade a good story for some extra food. If you were bad, well, let's just say people on the Oregon Trail had a lot of spare time to contemplate exactly how much they hated your off-key singing. So there you have it. The Oregon Trail job market, equal parts essential, horrifying, and vaguely comical in its absurdity. These were the people who kept things running, who made survival possible, and who, more often than not, ended up as cautionary tales for future generations. The next time you complain about your modern job, just remember, at least you're not wrestling mules, digging your own grave, or praying that today isn't the day your wagon wheel gives out. And if you ever find yourself yearning for a simpler life, just remember, the Oregon Trail wasn't simple. It was a slow-motion disaster, and every single person on it was just trying their best not to become another ghost on the prairie. If this narrative resonated with you, do support us. Hit that like button, drop a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe. Thank you for staying with us to the end. See you in the next video on Plaid Chronicles.